I think you are muted.
Okay. Okay. Hi, my name is Josephine. I'm the bilingual education coordinator at Support for Families, and I can speak Cantonese. And I'm here with my colleague Flavia. She is the lady just talked to you guys. She is also a bilingual education coordinator who can speak Spanish. If this is the first time you join our seminar, I would like to give you a brief introduction of our organization. Since 1982, Support for Families has provided support to families with children of disabilities of all ages. We have support groups for parents and youth. We provide one-on-one support through our family resource specialist who can connect you to various resources. We have a peer-to-peer parent mentor program, and we offer ongoing workshops and trainings such as tonight's presentation, and also IEP and positive parenting, etc. These workshops are mainly for caregivers of children with disabilities and the professionals who support them. So um, during with, uh, during the presentation, we would put in the links in the chat. There will be a workshop evaluation. This workshop evaluation helps us to improve our programming and also keep our program free for all. So these evaluations are a way for funders to measure the impact of our work. Without evaluation, we were not able to provide these free workshops. So please take a short moment to fill out this before you leave the sessions. Now, I would like to introduce our speakers from CASE, Community Alliance for Special Education, Lee and Karma. They will talk about writing SMART goals for the IEP process. Okay.
Thank you very much, Jojo. It's exciting to be here with you as always. And to our attendees and anyone who might be watching this later on the official YouTube channel of Support for Families, I just have to say you could be anywhere else, and the fact that you're choosing to be here with us, we are very grateful. Thank you. And especially here in San Francisco, it's a rainy evening, the week before Thanksgiving, lots going on. So thank you. Next slide, please. As many of you know, this is part 3 of a 4-part workshop. So we'll do a brief review of parts 1 and 2, but really we want to leave the majority of our time tonight for talking about goals, as well as progress monitoring, some practice, and question and answers. So next slide, please. And of course, we need to talk a little bit about CASE and who we are. I think one of the biggest things we want to talk about in the process here is making sure that everyone understands. Part 1 of our presentation was all about understanding your rights. And the biggest, most important right of all is that parents and family members are meaningful participants in the educational process with their students. Your feedback is incredibly valuable throughout the IEP process. You know your child and your student better than anyone else. And so IEP teams include you as a fully participating member. You have every right to make decisions, to ask for things, to provide input, to see all the documents. You are a fully participating member of the team. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of great ways that you can participate both with CASE and, more importantly, Support for Families. Shouldn't say more importantly, but just as importantly, if you're interested in learning more about Support for Families, this QR code on the top here takes you directly to the Support for Families calendar, so you can see their upcoming events. The bottom QR code takes you to the CASE our consultation calendar, or our intake form. At CASE, if you're interested after tonight, if you've heard something that piques your curiosity, if you say, all right, I'm ready to go, maybe I need a little bit more support, you're always welcome to join us at CASE for a free consultation with a professional special education advocate. So that bottom QR code takes you to our intake form, so you can schedule that. Next slide, please. And CASE is a co-author of the Special Education Rights and Responsibilities Manual. For those of you who are looking for more of a DIY, do-it-yourself resource, the Special Education Rights and Responsibilities Manual is amazing. CASE has been around for more than 40 years. We've been working with Disability Rights California since before they were Disability Rights California. And this manual has a lot of great resources. It's written in a very family-friendly, easy to access way. If you go to that link, there's a lot of different chapters on different topics. And so click on the topic that's of interest to you: assessments, discipline, early education, transition, whatever the case may be. And your questions are very likely there. It's written frequently asked question style. You can click on the question, your answer will be listed right there, along with the educational code, in case you need to go back to your school team and say, hey, wait a minute, the law says blah, blah, blah. You can do that and get the information right there. So anyway, I'm going too fast. Sorry, interpreters. Next slide, please. Okay. Karma, do you want to step in here, or do you want me to keep going?
Thank you, Lee. Hi, everyone. I am Karma Cook-Penwala. I'm the Director of Advocacy at CASE. It's so good to see all of you here tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to review with you the Individuals with Disabilities Act. This is the federal law that guarantees the rights of students with disabilities to access their education in our public schools. The Individuals with Disabilities Act is a federal law, so it applies in every single state in the United States. You will see these little things on the screen where it says 34 CFR 300.114. You see a few of those on this slide right here. That means it's federal law that we're talking about. Anytime you see 34 CFR, that is the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. So, what are the most important reasons and concepts from this law? The first is child find. Schools must evaluate and find students suspected. Suspected is the key word here. Suspected of having disabilities at no cost to parents. FAPE, a free, appropriate public education, must be available to all children residing in the state between the ages of 3 and 21. Including children with disabilities who have been suspended or expelled from school. That means if we see kids who are getting routinely suspended and routinely expelled from school, maybe we need to see if there's a disability that's behind all of these behaviors. That's a discussion for another night. The least restrictive environment. Children with disabilities are educated. Oh, could you go back, please? Thank you. Children with disabilities are educated with children who are non-disabled, and special classes, separate schooling, or removal of children with disabilities from the regular educational environment occurs only if the nature or severity of the disability is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. And that is so important to remember once we take a look at placement, and we will talk about placement next month in part 4. Let's move to the next slide. So, parents, what are your rights in special education? Parents, guardians, and students over the age of 18 have the right to participate, to receive prior written notice in response to their requests or concerns, to consent to programs that the schools might propose, to refuse to consent to programs the schools might propose, and to be given a non-discriminatory assessment at each time the triennial assessment comes up or in the initial assessment, to receive an independent educational evaluation or independent educational assessment every time the school district conducts an assessment with which the parent disagrees. Let's move on. Next slide. All right, I am going to popcorn to Stephanie Rivera. Stephanie, our intern at CASE, take this away.
Thank you so much, Karma. Good evening, everyone. My name is Stephanie. I'm a student intern with CASE, and I'm studying child development and psychology at San Francisco State. Besides growing up in the special education system as a youth, I'm also a parent of a child with an IEP, which has driven my motivation in learning how to best support her, just as many of us. Thank you for being here. So breaking down the IEP process, needs drive goals and goals drive services for IEPs because they are interconnected and work together to support the student's educational journey. First, identifying the needs of the student help determine the specific areas where they require support and accommodation. Based on these needs, goals are set to address and meet those areas of concern. These goals serve as the roadmap for students' progress and development. Once goals are established, they guide the selection and implementation of appropriate services and interventions. The services provided are designed to help the student work towards achieving their goals. For example, if a student has a goal to improve their reading comprehension, the IEP may include services such as specialized reading instruction or additional support from a reading specialist. The needs of the student inform the goals, and the goals in turn drive the selection of services and interventions. It's a collaborative and really dynamic process that ensures the IEP is tailored to meet the unique needs of each student and provide them with the necessary support to succeed. Some of the ways that we identify needs are by assessments, grades, test scores, behavior reports, observations, or an independent service provider. Based on the area of need, we can support the team in making SMART goals that are measurable and relevant. Once goals are written, we can talk services. Would you like to add anything else, Lee?
Stephanie, that was a beautiful overview. Thank you very much. Well done. I think the one thing that I would add is part of why you will see this same slide with this same process over and over and over again throughout our presentation is we want to make sure that all families understand this process and this through line, because this is how the school-based people on your IEP team are thinking about the process. We as families very often start with the classroom that our student is in, or we think about it from the services, but that's not where the school teams start. And so that often can make us not really hear each other in the process. So understanding that this is the way the school team is thinking, needs drive goals and goals drive services. And then we talk about what is the appropriate placement. That helps us understand why we're following this process. But I couldn't have explained it any better than you did, Stephanie. So thank you very much. Next slide, please. Now, there are 13 different eligibility categories. And again, we're still reviewing the information that we've talked about over the past 2 weeks. We will get to goals, we promise. So these 13 eligibility categories are written into the educational code. These are the ways that our students qualify for an IEP and then the services that come with them. Next slide, please. And as Stephanie just mentioned, when we talk about looking at those areas of needs that our students have, yes, we want to look at test scores. But an IEP is so much more than just academics. And we hear a lot of times from families, wait a minute, my school team told me that my child doesn't qualify for an IEP because they have straight A's. Well, that's not necessarily true, because an IEP is all about educational benefit, and educational benefit is more than grades. We're not talking about an individualized academic plan. We're talking about an individualized education plan. Education is social emotional. It's so much more. It is academics, but it's a lot above and beyond that. So we look at more than just the grades. We look at more than just the test scores. We look at a lot. So whatever is appropriate for your student. Next slide, please. And if you're not sure, here are some questions that you can ask. When we talk about educational impact or educational benefit, academic skills, social emotional, adaptive skills, behaviors, and so much more. Questions to ask yourself as you're preparing for an IEP meeting. Do you know how your child's disability will impact them in the classroom, or how it is impacting them in the classroom? This is something that you want to understand, and hopefully your IET, the rest of the IEP team understands as well. Can you make the case to your team of what you're seeing at home with the work that your child brings home, any of that, the reports that you're hearing from your teacher? There's a lot that goes into that. If you don't have enough information, if you can't make that case, what other information would be helpful? Are there other assessments that are needed? And the reason that we mention this here is we are in a very data-driven process here. This is one of my favorite quotes in the IEP process. Without data, you're just another person with an opinion. Data really helps us make our case throughout the entire IEP process. So next slide, please. All right, again, we talked about the different cognitive processes last month. We won't go into detail we won't go into much detail here. So next slide, please. And here's just a little bit more information about those cognitive processes. If anyone wants a copy of the slides after the presentation, we will have them for you. But when we talk about our children's cognitive abilities, we're talking about all the different processes in the brain, the way our children think. And there's a lot that goes into that. And that's why the triennial report, the report that's done every 3 years, is so long, is because we're looking at a whole lot of different brain functionality to figure out what works for our kids in the classroom, what doesn't work, and what we can do to adapt. So next slide, please. And then the other thing that we talked about last month, the bell curve, we went back to our statistics class to look at what does average mean, what is within the normal range or the average range. I shouldn't say the word normal. There is no such thing as normal. What is within the average range? What is outside of the average range? And how we use that data in order to figure out what a student's area of need is. And so understanding the test scores and understanding that data you have in front of you can be really, really, really powerful. And this is a lot of the work we do at CASE too, is helping families understand that big, thick report that they have in front of them. But the real takeaway for families here is that there is an average range of cognition where our students, we want the majority of our students to be performing. And so our test scores, our standardized test scores, help give us a lot of information on where our students are functioning. And then we can use that when we compare the cognitive data to the academic data, how a student's brain works versus how they are actually doing academically, that's how we can really tease out a lot about what's going on with a student. If we see that they are cognitively average, but academically below average, then that leads us to think, what's getting in the way? What's not working? Because based on what we see from these cognitive test scores, if they've got average test scores, they should be doing well amongst their average neurotypical peers. So why aren't they doing well in this environment? What do we need to dig deeper into figuring out about that? So that's one of the ways we use that data. So next slide, please. A little bit more, again, about the bell curve and the average. We've got in our last month's presentation, we have some samples where we dug into some data that really explains this a little better. And again, at CASE, we're always happy to help families understand this, but review next month's presentation or last month's presentation if you have any questions. Next slide, please. All right. As Stephanie so eloquently explained, needs drive goals, goals drive services. Next slide, please. All right, so we've covered the parents' rights. Last month, we talked about assessments. Now we're to the point of talking about goals. So the assessments and all the other data that's not just the test scores, the observations, the reports from our independent providers, the report cards, any data that the teachers send home, work samples, all that should help us figure out what our students' areas of need are. And so sometimes that's very obvious from an academic standpoint. But like I said before, this isn't all about academics. IEPs are about more than academics. They're about the whole child. And so a lot of things to think about that aren't necessarily academic is some of those other adaptive and social emotional domains. So for example, executive function. We see this really crop up and become a big issue for many of our kids moving from elementary school to middle school, for example. But a lot of times we have students who struggle with getting started with a task initiation, students who struggle with planning, prioritization. If you're a middle schooler with 7 different classrooms and 7 different teachers and 7 different assignments, how do you prioritize what needs to get done first, right? How do you manage your time around all of that? How do you stay organized? And especially for our teenagers, when you hit those hormonal teenage years, emotional regulation and impulse control, big issues. Goal setting, self-monitoring, and how do you stick through it? How do you persevere through the struggle? How do you actually get to the end and get everything done and get it turned in? When you need help, self-advocacy, how do you ask for help? What coping strategies do you have when things get tough? Do you understand how your brain works and what is easy for you and what is hard for you? And then how are our kids doing from a mental health standpoint? What technology do they have to use in the classroom that they may be struggling with? How are they doing with self-care? What does their behavior look like and other social emotional concerns? So just some of the other areas that we consider when we start thinking about areas of need and goal writing. Next slide, please. I think these next couple slides go into this in a little bit more detail. So for example, elementaries, I talked a lot about the transition to middle school. By the way, we do a couple separate workshops on transitioning from preschool to elementary school and transitioning from elementary school to middle school. Those are huge milestones in a family's life. We also do workshops on transitioning in high school and beyond. But when we talk about a student moving to elementary school, going from preschool, TK, into that big elementary school, there's a lot. It's a bigger school building usually. Or do our kids have the gross motor skills to navigate the building? Is it going to be sensory overload for some of our students who have sensory processing disorder? Are our kids able to keep, I can tell you, I volunteer in a classroom, a kindergarten classroom. And if I had $1 for every water bottle, lunchbox, backpack, jacket that ended up on the floor instead of in the cubby, I would own my house in San Francisco. That's a big deal for many of our children. What is appropriate for their grade level to attend to task, and to be able to complete work. Social skills are huge for our elementary schoolers. Participating, answering questions, waiting your turn, raising your hand, working in a group, sharing, asking for help when you need it, but not asking for help when you when you don't need it too, right? So there's a lot that happens, that some of our students just figure out the rules and figure out how to go along, and others need a little bit of support in those areas. So next slide, please. So the next slide is about middle school. We talked about some of this, so I won't read it all. But for middle school in particular, when our students all of a sudden have a much bigger building, they have to get between classes, sometimes using the restroom, stopping at the locker, and or grabbing all kinds of materials, changing for PE sometimes, and they have to do all of that in 4 to 5 minutes. That's a lot. So class attendance, getting there on time can be a challenge. And like I said before, staying organized. If you ever want to make sure something gets lost, put it in a 6th grader's locker. Staying organized, planning, time management, again, talked about that before. Turning homework in. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to parents, and I have the struggle with my own kids. We sit at home at the dining room table. We get the homework done, but it never seems to make its way to school and to get turned in, right? That last step, work completion. Anyway, class participation and self-monitoring, self-advocacy. Very often these are areas of need where we might end up writing goals because they're such a struggle for our students. Next slide. So we like to talk about the ALSUP at CASE. That is the assessment of lagging skills and unsolved problems. Dr. Ross Green, who is a guru when it comes to behavior, and a lot of his work talks about the proactive approaches that we have to take to support our students. His philosophy is that students do well if and when they can. And so when we are seeing negative behaviors from our students, it's not because they're bad kids. It's not because they're trying to be defiant. It's because they don't have the skills to do what it is we're asking them to do. So very often it's easy for the adults in the situation to recognize the behavior. We see that a lot. Behavior goals written into IEPs. But have we really dug in to understand where that behavior is coming from? Why? What is the area of need we should actually be addressing rather than the behavior? What's the root cause? So we will put the link in the chat to this ALSUP form, but it's a great, I would encourage families to take a look through it. Page 2, if you go to the next slide, please. Some of these lagging skills and unsolved problems that students haven't figured out how to solve on their own that lead to the big behaviors. The second page gives some prompts that can start those questions with your team. This can be a really great collaborative document to use with folks at your school team if you're seeing big behaviors and are trying to figure out why. So next slide, please. And Karma, can I turn it over to you?
Thank you, Lee. So let's get back to having goals in the IEP. What's the point of the goals? And why do we spend so much time in an IEP talking about goals, especially the old goals and the new goals? Next slide, please. We write goals to enable the student to be involved in and make progress towards the general education curriculum, which is here in California, is aligned to the Common Core standards. We address each educational need of the student that results from the disability and regardless of the disability category. Remember, this is an individualized education plan. So the goals for one student with autism will be very different from the IEP goals of another student with autism. The IEP goals of one student who is deaf will be very different from the goals of another student who is deaf. It all depends on the unique needs of that student. Oh, could we go back a slide, please? Thank you, Jojo. We write the goals to meet the student's unique needs in an individualized manner, and we have to measure the student growth and success. Did the students get to their expected destination at the end of the IEP year? And did the IEP provide meaningful educational benefit for the student? Next slide, please. Before I go over and review this slide, I want you to think of the IEP goal as the way we get the student from where they currently are to where their non-disabled peers are in the general education classroom. The IEP goals are how we make sure that the student is working on the same lessons, the same concepts, the same parts of the general education curriculum, just like their non-disabled peers. That's why we have goals. So the goals have to be based on the present levels of performance and present levels of educational performance. Well, that was the IDA at least 20 years ago. Now it's the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. Sometimes you'll hear us refer to that in English as the PLOFSP. A PLOFP statement must, first of all, describe the student's need in an academic or functional scale area, and must state the impact of the student's disability on their involvement in the general education curriculum, and must document the student's current levels of performance, which will serve as your baseline data in your goals. Inform the annual goals and appropriate special education services and supports required to meet those goals. Now, the present levels, when you take a look at the IEP, are way before the goals. So this means that when you sit down to review your child's IEP, you want to connect the needs and the present levels to the goals, to the services in the back of the IEP. You have to jump around that document. They don't make it easy to understand, and they certainly don't help you connect the dots, which is why we're trying to do that here. Just remember that big long story at the start of your IEP that describes your child's present levels. That's your baseline data for the goals in the IEP. Next slide. So how do we get from an area of need and the PLOF to an appropriately ambitious and measurable goal? Let's take a look. Next slide. Each goal starts with a measurable baseline. Where is the student right now? And can we put a number on that? Can we quantify the baseline? Baselines must match what is being measured in the goal itself. Assessment results from triennials or the annual testing are not appropriate measures to use. The baselines must have real data and must show the student where they are right now in the content area of the goal compared to where you want them to be 1 year later. So that means that even one best practice tip in writing a goal is that the words in the baseline and in the goal itself are mirrored. They are identical. And the only thing that is different are the numbers of where the student is. So maybe the student hasn't even attempted the skill in the goal. So that would be 0% or 0 out of 10 tries. Maybe in the goal, you say the student will be using this skill 80% of the time, or 8 out of 10 tries. That is what a measurable goal would look like. But that baseline data has to be where the student is right now. Let's go to the next slide. Here is what a good goal, will look like. We call this the IEP goal formula. So we start off in the first box by 1 year from now. Maybe it will be 1 year from that IEP meeting. Maybe it will be by the end of the school year. Not every goal is an annual goal, even though it goes in the IEP. But for the most part, we're writing these goals to last 1 year. By 1 year from now, the student will, and then you write in specifically, what will that student do? What is the skill the student is working on? Remember all those goal areas that Lee just reviewed with you? Go back to what the student's needs are, the assessments, the observations, that data that you have. What does the student need? Plug it in. Third box, in what setting or context will this be measured in the general education classroom? Will it be measured in therapy? We need to know where this goal will be taken place. Some goals take place across all educational settings. Could we go back one slide, please? Thank you. As measured by the fourth box, the first one on the bottom, as measured by, how are we going to measure this goal? Is it going to be by teacher report, by data collection? There has to be a way to measure the progress the student is making on this goal. And if it's teacher report and teacher observation, that teacher should be taking data that you as the parent can request, because you have the right to meaningful participation in this process. The fifth box, with how much accuracy? Remember how I said earlier, maybe the student hasn't started the skill yet, so it's 0 out of 10 opportunities, and or 0%, and we want to get the student to 80%. That 80% comes in this fifth box with 80% accuracy. Finally, with what supports? Is the student going to use a graphic organizer to help them write a 2-paragraph essay? Is the student going to be prompted to redirect and pay attention to their reading or their homework in class? Or will there be a visual cue to keep the student oriented to the lecture at the front of the classroom? It is appropriate to put up the reasonable and appropriate supports into the goal, because that helps the student learn over the year how they're going to make progress and continue to work on that skill in a way that will help them to make progress on the goal. Let's go to the next slide. Tricks of the trade. So some of our best practices here. Don't use the words will be able to, because the phrase will be able to isn't measurable. Don't say the student will be able to read aloud. Instead say the student will read aloud. Take all the ambiguity out of the goals. Make sure that all people monitoring this goal will measure it in the same way. If you look closely at the goals in the student's IEP, you will see that in each goal, there is a person, and it should be the school district staff member, who is responsible for implementing this goal. Sometimes it's multiple people, and you should make sure that there's a way for all of those people to collaborate and to work together in implementing the goal. As I just mentioned, teacher observation is not measurable data, is not measurable unless you have data. Make sure that if there's teacher observation, you have an understanding of how that teacher will make their observations and record their observations before you consent to the IEP. Let's move on to the next slide. So setting students up for success. Students don't magically meet goals on their own. How are we giving them the skills to meet the goals? Going back to that 6-box chart a few slides ago, we need to give appropriate supports and services in place to help the student reach their goals. So with social skills training and modeling, with access to a pre-drawn model or scribing or notes, maybe the student will use a visual schedule. Maybe the student will have access to the wellness center or to a preferred adult. The things that we need to consider when we're putting these goals together: what level of prompting is required to meet this goal, especially if it's a goal to reach independence in the skill? What accommodations are needed to achieve that goal? Are they checklists, graphic organizers, maybe a social skills group? Those things can be written into the goals. Let's go to the next slide. Lee, tag, you're it. You get to talk about Andrew F.
All right. I love Andrew F. Andrew F is our friend. So when we talk about Andrew F., we are talking about a Supreme Court decision oh my gosh, Karma, what year was Andrew F? 2017? Anyway, we'll look that up. I'll find that. Andrew F was a student in Colorado who had autism, and he was making zero progress year after year after year in his school. And so his parents said, not acceptable. We have a brilliant child who can be making progress in the right environment. And so they took Andrew out of his public school, put him into a school for students with autism where he thrived. And so the family then sued the school district to reimburse them for his tuition. The school district fought it all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed with the family, and it changed the whole standard for how we support students with disabilities. It put a whole bunch of new standards in place for how we work with students and the expectations that we have. Before, it was okay if a student just passed from grade to grade to grade, not making much progress. But now the new standard is, quote unquote, appropriately ambitious. So the quote from the decision here on the screen is, to meet its substantive obligation under the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, a school must offer an IEP reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstance. The goals must be appropriately ambitious in light of a child's individual circumstance. So what that does for us, next slide, please, is now, instead of a child just basically sitting in their classroom with no consequences, now we as an IEP team get together and we talk about what is appropriate for this child. If this is a second grader, for example, who those cognitive scores that we got in our assessments that we've already reviewed, those cognitive scores are average, well, then we would think it would be reasonable for that student to be achieving at a second grade level. They should be, if they have average cognition amongst their average second grade peers, they should be right there participating with them, right? So we should have those goals that are tied to the second grade standards. So that is how the standard was changed. So specific information from the frequently asked questions about this case decision. So if a child, so quote number 1 here, if a child is not making expected progress towards his or her annual goals, the IEP team must revise as appropriate the IEP to address the lack of progress. So basically, if we've got a goal that hasn't been met, we don't just say, meh, what we're gonna do? All right, moving right along. No, we put more services in place. We revise the goal a little bit, to make it more appropriately ambitious for next year, put more services in place and help the kid meet it next year. So point number 2 here from the Andrew F. decision. The IEP must be appropriately ambitious in light of his circumstances, just as advancement from grade to grade is appropriately ambitious for most child in the regular classroom. I think that one's pretty self-explanatory. And then from the grade level standard guidance that came out before Andrew F. In a situation where a child is performing significantly below the level of the grade in which the child is enrolled, an IEP team should determine annual goals that are ambitious but achievable. The goal should be sufficiently ambitious to help close the gap. So if we have a child that's performing below grade level, we want our goals to be ambitious. If a child is at first grade level, but they're in third grade, we don't want that goal to just bring them up to second grade in a year. No, we want to close that gap. We want to bring them up to third or fourth grade level. That's appropriately ambitious. All right, next slide, please. All right, so a little bit more information about appropriately ambitious. So when we're talking about a child who is in third grade, what does third grade math look like? What is appropriately ambitious for third grade math? Well, if you really want to geek out, here are some ways that you can do that. So first of all, we've linked here the Common Core math standards for California, the Common Core English Language Arts standards for California. We'll put these into the chat in a little bit too. The California Dyslexia Guidelines, which has tons of great information. The Zahner-Blauser written language production for handwriting and typing. That one's fantastic. There's a lot of great information in there about what is appropriate for a fourth grader. How many words per minute should they be able to write? There's a lot of great information in these. California PE, physical education model standards. We use this a lot for our kids who have gross motor issues and we're not sure what's appropriate for them from a physical education standpoint. So these are just some of the examples. If you have a kid who has a particular disability, student, child, if you're concerned about what might be appropriate, there are very likely standards in the area in which you're concerned that you can refer to. These are just some examples. And at CASE, we're also happy to refer you to more. You can always, we put up the QR code for our intake. We'll have that again at the end. So these are the kind of things that we could talk through in more detail with you in a consultation. Next slide, please. A few more things about goals. So a best standard is to write short-term objectives into a goal. If I am a parent of a student who struggles to turn in their homework, and my child has an F in one of their classes, and the only reason they have that F is because they haven't turned in any homework, then you better believe I want a work completion and a turning in homework goal. And if they're at 0 and we want to get them to 80 or 90%, because my kid is capable of A's and B's, thank you very much. So they might not be able to just get there right off the bat. I might need a short-term objective. Maybe the end goal for this time next year is my kid's going to turn in all of their homework all of the time. But before they're able to do that independently, we might have a short-term objective where for the first grading period, their case manager is prompting them every week, or maybe the case manager is actually going through my child's student view profile with them or their Google Classroom to see what assignments are missing and remind them, hey, take that crumpled up piece of paper out of your backpack and go turn it in right now. Go do that. So maybe that's short-term objective 1 until my child gets in the habit themselves of checking student view, of checking Google Classroom. And then by the end of the year, they're doing that independently and turning it in. That's what a short-term objective is. And that's how we scaffold. That's the word. We set our children up for success by giving them more support initially until they're able to do something on their own. And then we fade the support away. Progress monitoring, the next bullet point here. Progress monitoring, you should receive progress updates on goals with each report card. And this is really, really important. If you've got a child who's not reading at grade level, for example, you don't want to find out, you don't want to wait until next year, a year from now, that your child hasn't made any progress in their reading program. That is a lost year. That's not okay. You want to know periodically throughout the year what's going on. And if you're not seeing progress, you can always call another IEP meeting to discuss that and talk about more interventions that might be more helpful. Your goals should be jargon-free. You should be able to understand them. We mentioned the California state standards. There's a lot of technical stuff in there, but everything should be written not only in a way that you understand it. You shouldn't have to have a PhD in education to be able to read your child's IEP. So it's okay to ask for clarifications. It's okay to ask for the language to be changed. You are a fully participating member of the team. That's okay. And the goals should be written in a way that next year's team can understand them. So a lot of clarity is needed in the goals. Ask yourself and the team, when next year's teachers, therapists, and other professionals implement this goal, will we know what they expect of the student and how to measure it? Next slide, please. Karma put a great point into the chat. Parents can request IEP meetings at any time. If you have a progress report and you're concerned about whether or not the student is making sufficient progress towards the goal, call an IEP meeting to discuss the goal progress and update the goal if need be. All right, so here we go. We've got some sample goals in here we're going to go through with you. So now it's audience participation time. The chat has been very, very, very quiet. So now break out your typing fingers and let's go. So next slide, please. All right, Karma, jump in here with me. Stephanie, jump in here with me if you want. I think as we go through these goals, we're going to tag team a lot. But here's 2 quick samples, and then we're actually going to see goals on the format that you see in your IEP. So the first one here. By November 2nd, 2021, student will write an essay at 5th grade standard. Does that seem like a SMART goal to anyone in this room? You can use your reaction buttons on your phone too. If anyone, what do you think? Thumbs up, thumbs down. What do you all think? Is this a SMART goal? Not at all. Exactly. Thank you. Nope, I see one. Nope. What 5th grade standards? What are we talking about here, right? What's the specificity of what we're working on here, right? So when we get into our IEP meetings, we as advocates say, help us understand when you teacher or you case manager say an essay at 5th grade standards, what are those standards? What exactly do we want next year's team to be looking for? What will help them determine whether or not an essay that this child writes is up to those standards? So we might end up with a goal closer to something like this. By November 2nd, 2021, given a 5th grade writing topic and a graphic organizer, student will write 2 5-sentence paragraphs, including correct grammar, spelling, punctuation, and capitalization with 75% accuracy. Each paragraph will contain a topic sentence, sentences with supporting details, and a concluding sentence. So this might not be appropriate for all students. There's a great comment in the chat about this, right? For some students, this 5th grade standard, we might need to modify it. And for some students who have severe dysgraphia, maybe instead of writing 2 5-sentence paragraphs, they're going to use speech to text, and they're going to type it, and or maybe somebody else types it and they do the editing, right? There's a lot of different ways when we talk about appropriately ambitious. Again, each goal, like each IEP, is completely unique and individualized to the child. So if this is appropriately ambitious for your child, fantastic. If not, what is? Let's define that. All right. So by June 2024, goal 2 now, students' social interaction with peers and adults will improve. Now, we've actually seen these 2 goals. That's so at Case. We've seen them. We know that very well-intentioned IEP team members sometimes write goals like this. And so again, we would ask a lot of clarifying questions. What exactly does that mean to you? How is improve measurable? And so we might end up with a goal, hopefully something closer to this. By June 2nd, 2024, provided with Michelle Garcia Winner's Thinking About You, Thinking About Me, Social Skills Curriculum and Instruction or Modeling, student will demonstrate pro-social skills with adults and peers with and without disabilities. Student will initiate positive conversations with adults and peers at least 2 times a day, measured by daily collection. I still don't think this is quite measurable enough, right? I would want to know a little bit more about, that's very, very broad. Do we want to put some parameters around that? Yeah. So, and another thing, we very often do not see school districts who are willing to write a specific curriculum into the goal. We have a lot of students with dyslexia, for example, and we know that the science of reading and structured literacy are the interventions and just best practices, right? We know all kids need the foundational skills. Yet most school districts aren't going to say, using the Linda Mood Bell curriculum or using the Wilson reading program or using Spire, because staff changes, curriculum changes. What if next year's teacher knows a different curriculum instead? How are they going to then meet these goals, right? So we tend to see it more general than we might see this more general, more like using a social skills curriculum instead of specifically naming Michelle Garcia Winner's social thinking curriculum. Next slide, please. All right. So, and we have an educational specialist who has a special education background in the house, who has put some great information into the chat. And she pointed out, you could say something like multi-sensory structured literacy curriculum, right? There are a lot of ways. And if you have a child with dyslexia, those California dyslexia guidelines should be your best friend. If you haven't read them, print them out, keep them by your bedside table, fall asleep to them at night. There's a lot of great information in there. All right, so next, some sample goals here. Karma, what do you have to say about these goals?
All right, let's take a look at these goals. Remember, you've heard us say the word baseline before. And so if your student has an IEP, you've seen what this baseline is. Let's take a look at, first of all, the area of need, functional communication and self-advocacy. That tells us what the area of need for that student is and what they'll be working on. So the baseline, the student is observed to participate in activities. However, when he is having difficulty producing sounds and words, he will continue to attempt to produce the word by himself, not asking for assistance. Wow, I could continue on with this baseline, but I can tell you right now, this baseline does not allow us to have a measurable goal. There are no numbers in that baseline to tell us where exactly the student is in the goal area that we want him to make progress on. Now let's read the goal. By April of 2022, the student will demonstrate self-advocacy by raising his hand and verbally asking for help in Mandarin and or in English from a communication partner when he requires assistance in 4 out of 5 opportunities, and given no more than 1 prompt suggested. If you need help, what can you say? And in 3 consecutive data collection sessions. All right, we have a lot to unpack here, folks. First of all, what the heck is that baseline? Look how much information is in that baseline, and look how much less information is in the goal itself. We want the student to demonstrate self-advocacy by raising his hand and verbally asking for help. But we don't have any information on raising the hand in the baseline, and we really don't know the student, have a student really quantifying whether or not he's saying, I need help. So what should that baseline be? Does anyone have a guess?
Ooh, the chat got quiet. The chat got quiet. All right, well, here's a hint. Karma mentioned earlier that sometimes you might not be able to do anything. You might not be able to do the goal at the start of the goal. So that would be 0 out of 10, 0% of observed opportunities, however you want to frame it. But you have to know where you're starting to know where you're going, right?
Absolutely. So what the baseline should read is, as of date, the student does not demonstrate self-advocacy by raising his hand and verbally asking for help from a communication partner when he requires assistance. The student can do this 0 times and is at 0% for the goal. He has done this 0 times in 5 opportunities and across 3 consecutive data collection sessions. Do you realize how I literally read the goal, but as the baseline? That is the easiest way to have a perfectly measurable goal. Some of you might be familiar with the phrase comparing apples to oranges. And so often we see apples in the baseline and oranges in the goal. We need to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples. So there's an apple in the baseline and an apple in the goal. Make sure that the goal and the baseline are talking about the same thing and may even be worded the same way, except for the numbers and the percents. That's how we get a smart and measurable goal. Should we move to the next slide?
Before we do, I wanted to point out one other thing. Sorry, Jojo, if you wouldn't mind going back. Another way to look at this is, and this would be where having some more information about, yeah, if you would go back, please, some more information from the baseline is, I wonder if this student, how many prompts does the teacher have to give this student before they will raise their hand? That could be another way to look at this. That could be another data point to add into the baseline here. Maybe this student, if prompted 3 times, or if shown the verbal gesture, maybe, or not verbal gesture, the nonverbal gesture to raise your hand, maybe that's what the student needs. But if we want the student to get to the point where they don't need that gesture and they can just independently raise their hand, then we need to be more specific about that in the goal as well. Right. Thank you. Okay. And then the other question that I would have in that last goal, there were a lot of people who were working on it. Is that generalized in the classroom? Is the speech and language pathologist just going to be working on it in the speech and language room? Is that person going to push into the general education class to measure? Where's that going to, tell me more. Tell me more about what you all are planning with this goal. All right. Thank you. Those are my comments. I'm ready to move on to the next one.
All right, here is an executive functioning and planning and prioritization goal. This is probably a goal you're going to see in middle school or high school. So let's take a look. In the baseline, as of fall 2020, the student will complete all of his assignments with the assistance of a paraeducator who assists the student with breaking down assignments and meeting deadlines. The student will need to develop planning and prioritization skills in order to independently complete assignments in a timely manner. At this time, student demonstrates 0% accuracy with independence. He is not able to independently break assignments into smaller parts, estimate the time it will take to complete assignment or part of an assignment, assign due dates, or track assignments. Now, it looks like we actually have a number in this baseline. It's still pretty long, but at least we know that the student is currently at 0% with independence in planning and prioritization of his classwork. The goal itself, when given a short or long-term assignment, and with support of pre-taught tools and strategies, the student will break the assignment into smaller parts, estimate the time it will take to complete each part of the assignment, prioritize the order in which he will work on each part, assign the due dates for each part, track each component as it is completed, and hand in upon completion and generalized across settings, school, home, after school, learning hub, and so forth, with 80% accuracy across all given opportunities as measured by teacher charted observation and student work samples. Did you note the tie in the language between the baseline and the goals there? The goals and the baseline both referred to estimating the time that it will take to complete an assignment, assign the due dates, track assignments, and independently break assignments into smaller parts. That the fact that we have both of those, all of those statements in both the baseline and the goals means that we're comparing apples to apples right here. And we're going from 0 to 80. Not 0 to 80 in 3.5, but we're going to from 0 to 80 within 1 year. And this is an example of how that goal is going to be tracked and what exactly will be done to support the student in reaching that goal. The very first line of the goal itself says that the student will have the support of pre-taught tools and strategies in order to complete these tasks independently. Now, at the next session, we'll talk about how services support the goals. But because you see this line in here, what I can say is it looks like this is a goal that's going to be tied to specialized academic instruction, probably in a study skills class. So in the study skills class, the student will learn those pre-taught tools and strategies to help him break the assignment into smaller parts, estimate the time it will take to complete each part of the assignment, prioritize the order in which he will work on each part, and assign due dates for each part of his assignments and so forth. So that goal touches on all aspects that we've been talking about thus far. How do you break down and write the actual goal itself that is going to work for the student? If you have your phone with you, I want you to take a picture of this slide right now, because when you go to write your goals, you want to have a baseline that reflects what's in the goal and also shows where exactly the student is right now and where we'll get them to 1 year later. Now, you'll also see the people responsible for this: the resource teacher, which is the RSP, the paraprofessional who will be there in the moment to support the student as they're doing their work, and the general education teacher. That also tells me that this is a student who spends some time in the general education classroom, and they also go to a study skills class, maybe once or twice or 3 or 4 times a week. So together, you can see all the people who are supporting the student in reaching the goal. What's better is you can see at the bottom of the goal the short-term objectives. So maybe we're breaking the goal down by the particular tasks. The first short-term objective is that the student will break the assignment into smaller parts. The second short-term objective is that once the student has broken the assignment into smaller parts, he will estimate the amount of time it will take him to complete each part of the assignment. Now we can see the student beginning to develop and implement this skill that the goal is helping him to reach. We can't see the second or the third and the fourth short-term objectives, but I'm willing to bet that they're the other parts of the goal, that as long as the student begins to break down the assignment into its smaller parts, estimate how long it will take him to complete that assignment, prioritize the order in which we'll work on each part, assign due dates, this student is actually going to reach that goal by the due date of the goal that you can see there. All right, Lee, do you have anything else to add?
No, that was a great overview of this goal. And I'm looking at the time. It's 8:19. We're supposed to end in 10 minutes. And we have quite a few more goals to go through. So I think the next few we might want to just I think we're going to have to go faster through the rest of the goals if we want to finish. We did state we would stay a little bit longer if need be, so we can absolutely do that. But we do already have some questions in the chat too. So as we go to the next slide, Karma, I'll ask you one of the questions from the chat. Who is typically responsible for establishing the baseline and writing these goals?
The IEP team. So the IEP, establishing the baseline, thank you. So the person who establishes the baseline, that's going to be your school staff, the people who are working with the student and who have the data. They establish the baseline because they are the ones taking and collecting that data of the student. For example, you have your classroom teacher, your behaviorist, counting how many times the student might engage in property destruction or in physical aggression for students who have behavior goals. maybe speech and language pathologist is going to take some data on how many times a student speaks with a lisp and saying 1 or 2 sentences at a time. That is your baseline data. Then that member of the IEP team brings it to the table during the IEP meeting, presents the data to the IEP team, and the IEP team writes the goal and approves the goal, and the parent consents to the goal.
And the parent can provide a lot of feedback into the goals too. Very often, we see parents say, well, I sit at home and I do homework with my child and I see that their struggle is this that's all very relevant too. However you interact academically, social, emotionally, what your child is coming home and telling you, all of that can inform the goals as well. So as far as this goal here, so let's move on to the next goal. All right, let's see. There's a lot of great questions in here. Okay, this is a very similar. This goal has a lot of great data in the baseline. The case manager here did a lot of work across the student. This is a middle schooler. And this middle schooler's case manager worked across different classrooms to get all this data. And exactly as Karma was just saying, worked with the student in their study skills class to build a lot of this skill set, and helped this child meet this goal. But this is the goal itself, the baseline. During the spring semester, student had 62 assignments in English language arts and turned in 25 out of 62 assignments late or left them incomplete. So 40% of his work was late or incomplete. During the spring semester, 50% of his math work was turned in late or left incomplete. 6% of his math assignments and English language arts assignments were not turned in. What do you think this child's grades were like? So the goal in this case absolutely matches the baseline, and provides a lot of scaffolding. Given an in-class or take-home assignment and a deadline, for example, a specific time when a timer goes off, the end of class the following day, the student will complete the assignment and submit it to the designated area on time. So a lot of work to do there with that student. When we'll get to how the goals drive services next week. I don't know, Karma, if you have anything else to add here. There's a lot of examples that we're not going to have time to get through in this slide, in this presentation though. So I'm wondering, next slide, or do you have anything to add?
Leah, I think you did a pretty good job. Yeah, we'll continue on. Yeah, okay, here we have a reading and decoding goal. So the baseline from October of 2020, when given a list of 10 words, the student will be able to correctly, or the student is able to correctly identify 2 out of 10 syllables. When given a list of 10 words, the student is able to correctly divide 2 out of 10 words. When reading a text, a student often relies on context and background knowledge to decode new words. Occasionally breaks down multisyllabic words independently. However, he will continue to need more support and prompting in decoding. When given a list of multisyllabic words, student had difficulty identifying the number of syllables in each word and how each word divides in parts or syllables. Well, this is kind of tricky, right? We've got some baseline data in there that is very concrete. We know what happens when the student gets a list of 10 words, how many syllables the student's going to find, or how many words the student can divide when given a list of 10 words. But the rest of the information does not have a number attached. It's not quantifiable. So let's see what the goal says. By May of 2021, when given a list of 4th grade multisyllabic words in isolation, or words within grade level text containing initial blends, 3-letter blends, digraphs, trigraphs, short and long vowel patterns, inflection endings, root words, prefixes, and suffixes. Wow, that's a lot. The student will accurately combine these elements to decode each word with 80% accuracy across all opportunities as measured by informal assessments, running records, and teacher observation. Can anyone see the problems or how problematic this baseline might be? We don't see a lot of crossover between the baseline and the goal itself. The measurable information we have from the baseline is only about identifying syllables and dividing words. And yet there's so many other skills the student is going to be asked to do in the following year. Not even 1 year. The baseline, if you note, is from October of 2020, and the goal is due by May the following year. So the student doesn't have a full year to work on this goal. That's a very, very ambitious goal. And we don't even know where the student is beginning on all of these tasks that they are asked to complete. We also would want to make sure that the teacher observations are being tracked and documented so that the teacher is keeping a list of all the observations of the students completing these tasks. Now we can see that a resource specialist, paraprofessional, and a classroom teacher are all responsible for implementing this goal. So I would be very curious to see how the 3 of them are going to work together to support the student. Oh, and did you note that the goal itself says, when given a list of 4th grade level words, we don't know what grade level words are in the baseline, what the student is working on right now. All right. Any more comments, or should we keep moving on?
I think we're going to have to keep going. It is 8:30 now, and we have a lot of great questions in the chat. So let's skip through the rest of the goals. And let's, and if anyone wants some more of these, we really want to talk about progress monitoring, because it's one of the things that it's most important for families to understand here in the IEP process is the goal monitoring and whether or not a student meets the goals in their IEP. This is the accountability mechanism of the IEP. You know, this is why it's so important for goals to be measurable and for them to be specific and time-bound and all the things we talk about in our SMART goals, because this, when we get into that IEP meeting this time next year after we've written these goals and we're either giving ourselves high fives because these students have met the goals, because we've done what we need to do, great, wonderful. But so often we get to the point of the student hasn't met the goal. And sometimes it comes as a shock, and it should never come as a shock, because we should be progress monitoring throughout the year. We should know, and this is a good example of this. So this right here is for a student who has reading fluency issues. This parent has created a chart to show where the student is or where the student was before the intervention was started, and how that student, how their growth has changed. And you can see by the dots where the student actually is. Now, there's some of the data that's missing here. If you look at the top, that it looks like about 52 words is the beginning of 2nd grade benchmark, right? So we want the student to be that dotted line. That is great progress. But what we need to know is where the student is grade level right now. If this is a first grader heading into second grade, it looks like they're on target. Wonderful, fantastic. If this is a third grader heading into fourth grade, this is not appropriately ambitious enough. We need to put more intervention in place. And so that is how we use the goals. If the goals are being met because we're writing them to be appropriately ambitious, excuse me. One of the comments that someone asked in the chat was, my daughter has autism, spectrum disorder, and intellectual disability. She struggles to do subtraction. We are asking, how do we nicely request a goal to make her get improvement, not to excuse that she's not capable of doing it because she has intellectual disability? I don't expect miracles, but her level is well beyond first or second grade. She should be able to do fourth grade level math. So we have to make sure that we explain to the team, just because a student has intellectual disabilities doesn't, I mean, they are still capable of doing work. And so we have to find what is that appropriate level and then write a goal that gets them there. And so that's where going back to the assessment data to figure out what are their cognitive skills, what can we do to modify, maybe we let the student use a calculator. There are other ways to do math besides hand calculations. What is it that we need to do to write that goal to get them to the grade level math where we want? And then we need to track and monitor and show how the student is making progress or not. Next slide, please. Here's another example we see for reading progress monitoring. On the left is the Fontes and Pinnell score at CASE for our students who struggle to read. We highly discourage teams from writing goals around the Fontes and Pinnell assessments. There's been a lot of data. Those Fontes and Pinnell assessments have been in the news a lot lately. But there are much better ways to measure reading progress for our students with reading struggles. And so come talk to us more, read those California dyslexia guidelines. There's a lot of information. But when you talk about what is appropriately ambitious, there are a lot of flaws in F&P. So just, that's another issue that we want to make sure everyone, make sure you understand how things are being measured. That's an important part of progress monitoring. Reading inventory, we see used a lot, much better correlation. But anyway, the best correlation is to the reading program that is going to be used with your child. For example, like I said before, we don't often see particular programs written into IEPs, but many school districts use Spire. And so sometimes, or LIPS or things like that. So if it is a district adopted curriculum, we will sometimes see the district write that in. Anyway, I'm getting into the weeds here. We could talk a little bit more about some of that stuff, but we have time constraints. So moving right along. Next slide, please. Okay, Karma, what happens if students don't meet their goals?
Well, if a student doesn't meet their goals, we're probably looking at a number of things that could have happened. But what we do need to focus on is that the area of the goal still an area of need for the student? If it is still an area of need, and the student still has not made progress towards the goals, is not satisfying the goal of need for the goal in any other way, then we have to continue writing goals in that student's area of need. But we have to change the goal. You can't just take one goal and carry it over, copy and paste from one year to the next. We need to figure out why the student didn't meet the goal and what can we change about the goal so that the student will meet it the following year. Maybe we're changing the curriculum that the student is working towards. Maybe we're changing the accommodations and supports that the student needs to reach that goal. Maybe I don't want to say lowering expectations, but maybe we'll just slightly, instead of getting the student to 90% in a goal, maybe we'll change it to 80% and see how the student does. Remember, goal monitoring and progress is so important. It's why you, parents and guardians, get progress reports with every report card that comes in the mail. You need to review those report cards. Check the progress reports. Check the progress reports against that copy of the annual IEP that was signed. If the student is making some progress towards that goal, great, but make sure that the student continues to make progress or is making a reasonable and steady progress throughout the year. If we're seeing a student's progress looking like this, when it should be looking like this, then we need to intervene and call an IEP meeting and work together to change that goal. The IEP is a living document. It can be changed at any time, but you need to get the team together to discuss this, call an IEP meeting, and take a look at the data that shows you if the student is or is not meeting their goal. Next slide. All right, any questions other than what's been put in the chat?
We have some great questions in the chat, though, that I would love to see us cover.